A fateful encounter in the summer heat. The summer sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the dusty roads of Willow Creek. It was a small, forgotten town, tucked away between endless fields and thick forests. The town's heart lay in its old traditions, unchanging and deeply rooted, where everyone knew each other's stories, except for the ones buried too deep in silence. This was where Emily had lived her entire life. She had grown up in a modest home on the outskirts, a part of the town where the streets were lined with weather-worn houses, where families gathered on porches after long days of work, and where secrets whispered through the wind like ghostly confessions. Emily had never felt the need to leave. She was a woman of purpose, raised by a mother whose hands knew the art of healing and whose prayers could soothe the deepest wounds. Following in her footsteps, Emily had become a nurse at the town's only clinic. Her life revolved around tending to the sick and injured, a calling she had embraced with pride. She had never entertained thoughts of adventure beyond Willow Creek, nor did she have time for frivolous romance. That was until the town's summer festival, an event meant to bring joy but destined to change her life forever. The festival was an annual tradition, a day when the townsfolk set aside their burdens and gathered at the central square. The air was thick with the scent of roasted corn and smoked meat, blending with the laughter of children running barefoot across the grass. The church choir sang joyful hymns from an open window, their voices drifting over the crowd like a soft lullaby. Emily had barely allowed herself a break from her duties at the clinic, but this year her mother insisted. "You work too hard, child," her mother had said, gently pushing her out the door that morning. "Go and enjoy yourself for once." Emily sighed, adjusting her simple cotton dress before stepping into the lively crowd. She walked past vendors selling homemade pies, crafts, and old books. She smiled and exchanged greetings with familiar faces, but her mind remained restless. She was about to turn back when she noticed an elderly woman standing near the shaded part of the field, struggling to catch her breath. Her instincts kicked in immediately. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Emily asked as she hurried to the woman's side. The old woman's face was flushed, and her hands trembled as she clutched her chest. "The heat, it's too much," she gasped. "Here, sit down." Emily guided her toward a nearby oak tree and fanned her gently. "Just take slow, deep breaths." A voice cut through the crowd, deep, calm, and filled with concern. "Is she going to be okay?" Emily looked up to find a man standing nearby, his gaze locked onto the older woman. He was tall, with a commanding presence that drew immediate attention. His features were sharp yet kind, his dark eyes reflecting a mixture of worry and curiosity. He wore a crisp white shirt with rolled-up sleeves, revealing strong tanned arms that suggested years of hard labor. Emily blinked, momentarily taken aback by his presence. "She just needs to cool down," she assured him before turning back to the elderly woman. "Have you been drinking enough water today?" The woman nodded weakly. I think so." "Let me get her something," the man offered, disappearing into the crowd before Emily could respond. Minutes later, he returned with a glass of cold lemonade. Emily helped the woman take small sips, watching as her breathing gradually steadied. "You should sit with her for a while," the man said. "It's too hot for anyone to be standing in this sun." Emily gave him a grateful nod before finally asking, "Do you know her?" The man hesitated for a moment before replying, "She's a family friend." Emily studied him for a moment. There was something about him, an air of mystery, a quiet confidence that was neither arrogant nor dismissive. His presence intrigued her in a way she couldn't quite understand. "I'm Emily," she said, extending a hand. "Thomas," he replied, shaking it firmly. As the day stretched on, Emily found herself drawn into easy conversation with Thomas. He spoke of life beyond Willow Creek, of cities filled with towering buildings and streets that never slept. He had spent years traveling, working in different places, but something had pulled him back to this small town. Emily listened intently, fascinated by his stories. It wasn't often she met someone who had seen the world outside their tiny corner of existence. "What about you?" Thomas asked. "Have you ever thought about leaving?" Emily chuckled. "I don't think I've had the time to think about it. My life is here." "Sometimes life has a way of pulling you in directions you never expected," he said, his tone thoughtful. Emily glanced at him curiously. There was something in his voice, a hint of sadness, maybe even regret. She wondered what had brought him back to a place like Willow Creek, a town that so many had tried to escape from. Before she could ask, a distant voice called out, "Thomas, there you are." A man approached, dressed in fine clothes that suggested wealth and status. His expression was stern as he glanced between Emily and Thomas. "I've been looking for you," the man said. "We need to talk." Thomas's face darkened. "Not now, Daniel." Daniel's gaze shifted to Emily, his brows furrowing slightly. "Who's this?" "Emily," Thomas said simply. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line before he turned back to Thomas. "Come find me when you're done," he muttered before walking away. Emily felt the tension lingering in the air. "Who was that?" "My brother," Thomas said with a sigh. "He's complicated." Emily decided not to push further. Instead, she glanced at the setting sun. "I should probably head home." Thomas nodded but hesitated before speaking again. "Would you like to meet up again sometime? Maybe for a walk?" Emily smiled softly. "Maybe." As she walked away, she could still feel his gaze on her back. Something about their meeting felt significant, as if fate had orchestrated it for reasons yet unknown. But fate had a cruel sense of humor. Had she known the truth, the horrifying, unspeakable truth, she would have never let herself feel that flicker of warmth in her heart. Because Thomas wasn't just any man, and their connection was far deeper than either of them could have imagined. Shadows of the past. The evening air in Willow Creek carried a strange stillness as Emily walked home from the festival, her mind replaying every moment of her encounter with Thomas. There was something about him that felt both familiar and foreign, like a melody she had heard in a dream but could not quite place. She had met plenty of men before, men who flirted with easy charm or admired her kindness, but none had stirred something deep within her the way Thomas did. And yet, beneath his warmth and curiosity, she sensed a shadow, an untold story that lingered in his voice and behind his dark eyes. Her mother was waiting for her on the porch, rocking gently in her old wooden chair. The scent of night-blooming jasmine drifted through the air. "You stayed out later than I expected," her mother said, her tone light but observant. "I met someone," Emily admitted, sitting beside her. Her mother raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and who might that be?" "His name is Thomas. He just returned to town." "Do you know him?" A flicker of something, recognition, hesitation, passed through her mother's face so quickly Emily almost missed it. But she had spent her life reading people, and she didn't miss much. "Thomas," her mother repeated slowly. "That's not a name I've heard in a long time." Emily frowned. "You do know him." Her mother's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. "Not well," she said after a pause. "His family left years ago. I didn't think they'd ever come back." "Why did they leave?" Her mother's lips pressed together, as if deciding how much to say. Finally, she sighed. "There was an incident, best left in the past." Emily knew better than to push. Her mother wasn't one to gossip, and if she believed some things were best left unsaid, there had to be a reason. Still, curiosity gnawed at Emily as she lay in bed that night, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the crickets outside. Who was Thomas really? And what was it about his past that made her mother so uneasy? The following days passed in a blur, but Thomas remained in her thoughts. She saw him around town, at the general store, outside the old train station, walking near the fields with a faraway look in his eyes. And then, one evening, he came to the clinic. Emily was finishing up with a patient when she noticed him standing near the door, hands in his pockets. She approached with a questioning look. "Are you hurt?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, but I thought maybe we could take that walk you mentioned." She hesitated only for a moment before nodding. "Let me grab my coat." They walked in silence at first, the cool night air settling between them. The town stretched out before them, its lights flickering like distant stars. "You've lived here all your life," Thomas said. It wasn't a question, just an observation. Emily nodded. "I never saw a reason to leave." "And if you had a reason?" She glanced at him. "Are you trying to give me one?" He chuckled softly, but didn't answer. Instead, he stopped near a large oak tree, the same one where they had first met during the festival. "I used to come here when I was a boy," he said, "back when things were different." Emily studied him, waiting for him to continue. "My family was respected once," he said. "We had money, influence. My father was a businessman, strict but ambitious. He wanted the best for us. But one mistake changed everything." Emily frowned. "What happened?" Thomas's jaw clenched slightly. "A scandal. A secret that tore us apart. My mother was devastated. She didn't have the strength to stay, so we left. My father never spoke of it again." Emily felt a strange unease settle in her stomach. "And now you're back." "I wanted to see if anything had changed," he admitted. "If the past still had its grip on this place." Emily watched him closely. "And has it?" Thomas met her gaze. "I don't know yet." The way he looked at her then, intense, searching, made her breath hitch slightly. There was something unspoken between them, something neither fully understood. And yet, standing there beneath the moonlight, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to step into something far bigger than she had ever imagined. Over the next few weeks, Emily and Thomas grew closer. They spent more evenings together, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about the cities he had traveled to, the things he had seen. She told him about her dreams, her fears, her love for the people of Willow Creek. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt something she had not allowed herself to feel: hope. But the town was watching, and so was her mother. One evening, as she was returning home, her mother was waiting for her again. This time, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "You need to stay away from him," she said firmly. Emily's heart sank. "Why?" "Because there are things you don't understand." "Then explain them to me." Her mother hesitated before shaking her head. "I can't. Not yet." Emily clenched her fists. "He's not dangerous. He's kind, fateful. Why does everyone act like he's some kind of threat?" Her mother sighed, looking at her with something that almost resembled pity. "Because some wounds never heal, Emily, and some truths are better left buried." Emily wanted to argue, but the look in her mother's eyes silenced her. Still, she couldn't ignore the feeling in her gut. There was something about Thomas, something hidden, something important, and she was determined to find out what it was, even if it meant uncovering the one secret that could shatter everything. A secret unraveled. The days passed in a strange blur, each one pulling Emily deeper into the mystery that surrounded Thomas. He had become an undeniable presence in her life, one she both welcomed and feared. Their walks grew longer, their conversations more intimate, but with every story he shared, she felt there was something he was holding back. Her mother's warning still echoed in her mind. Stay away from him. But how could she when he had already carved himself into her heart? The town was watching, whispers trailing after them like shadows. The people of Willow Creek were not known for their silence when it came to scandal, and Emily could feel the weight of their judgment every time she walked through the marketplace or stepped into church on Sunday. It was only a matter of time before the truth found her. One evening, Emily sat on her porch, the warm breeze rustling through the magnolia trees. She had expected Thomas to visit, but instead, she found herself alone with her thoughts. She could no longer ignore the feeling that there was something she wasn't being told, something about his family, about why they had left so abruptly all those years ago. Her mother had refused to answer her questions, but there was someone else who might. Miss Hattie. Miss Hattie was one of the oldest residents of Willow Creek, a woman whose memory stretched back farther than anyone else's. If there was a secret to be uncovered, she would know it. The next afternoon, Emily made her way to the small house on the edge of town where Miss Hattie lived. The woman greeted her with a knowing smile as she settled into her rocking chair on the front porch. "I was wondering when you'd come to see me," Miss Hattie said, eyes twinkling. Emily frowned. "You knew I would." Miss Hattie chuckled. "Child, you've been sniffing round the past like a hound after a fox. Course I knew you'd come." Emily hesitated before speaking. "It's about Thomas." The old woman's face darkened, the amusement slipping away like a tide retreating from shore. "You don't know, do you?" she murmured. "Know what?" Miss Hattie let out a long sigh, as if she had been carrying the weight of this secret for far too long. "His mother." Emily blinked. "What about her?" "She didn't leave this town by choice, child. She disappeared." A chill ran down Emily's spine. Disappeared. Miss Hattie nodded. "One day she was here, the next, gone. No goodbyes, no word. Folks said she ran off, but—" She shook her head. "Some of us weren't so sure." Emily's heart pounded. What happened to her? Miss Hattie's gaze grew distant. "Rumors say she found out something she wasn't supposed to. Something about her own family. And then, just like that, she was gone." Emily swallowed hard. "Did they ever find her?" Miss Hattie shook her head. "No, child. But her husband, he never looked for her. Not once." A sick feeling settled in Emily's stomach. "And Thomas? He was just a boy when it happened," Miss Hattie said. "He and his brother were sent away soon after. Some say their father didn't want them asking questions." Emily felt dizzy. Thomas's mother had vanished without a trace, and no one had ever found out why. And now, after all these years, he had come back to a town that had buried the truth. Was he searching for answers too? That night, Emily met Thomas by the river. She had barely spoken a word since she arrived, her thoughts tangled in the weight of what she had learned. "You're quiet tonight," Thomas observed. She hesitated before finally asking, "Why did your mother leave?" Thomas's body stiffened. "What?" "Your mother," Emily repeated. "Why did she leave Willow Creek?" He let out a slow breath, his gaze darkening. "You've been asking around." "Because no one will tell me the truth," Emily said. "And I think you know more than you're saying." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he spoke. "My mother didn't leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was taken." Emily's breath caught. Thomas's hands curled into fists. "I was young, but I remember the night she disappeared. I remember her arguing with my father. She was crying. She said something about a secret, something that could destroy everything. And then, she was gone." Emily stared at him. "And you think your father?" "I don't think." Thomas interrupted, his voice sharp. "I know." Emily's blood ran cold. Why didn't anyone do anything? "Because my father was powerful," Thomas said bitterly. "And because this town knows how to keep its secrets." Emily felt the weight of the truth pressing down on her. The town had let a woman disappear, had chosen silence over justice. And now, Thomas was back, carrying the burden of a past no one wanted to remember. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. Thomas looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm going to find out what happened to my mother." Emily shivered. She had thought she was stepping into a love story, but this was something else entirely. She had stepped into a mystery, a dark, tangled web of lies, betrayal, and a truth that could change everything. And the deeper she went, the more she realized. Some secrets were never meant to be uncovered. The unforgivable truth. Emily lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, Thomas's words echoing in her mind. "I'm going to find out what happened to my mother." The weight of the secret sat heavy on her chest. A woman had vanished without a trace. A town had turned a blind eye. And now, after all these years, Her son had returned to uncover the truth. Emily wanted to believe that the answers would bring justice, but deep in her gut, she knew the truth wouldn't set anyone free. Some wounds festered too long to ever heal. Still, she couldn't walk away. She had to help him. The next morning, Emily made her way to the town's archives. The small, dusty office sat in the back of the courthouse, where old records lay forgotten under layers of time. The clerk, an elderly man with thick glasses, looked up as she stepped inside. "Miss Emily," he greeted, surprised. "What brings you here?" She hesitated before responding. "I was hoping to look through some old town records. From about 20 years ago." The man raised an eyebrow. "Any particular reason?" Emily forced a smile. "Just some genealogy research." He studied her for a long moment before shrugging. "Well, if it's records you're after, they're in those cabinets back there." She thanked him and hurried toward the dusty files, her heart pounding. She sifted through stacks of birth certificates, marriage records, and land ownership papers. And then she found it. A police report. "Missing person, Eleanor Carter." Emily's fingers trembled as she scanned the report. Thomas's mother had vanished on a summer night, last seen leaving her home. The case had been opened, but never investigated. No searches, no follow-ups. The last note in the file chilled her to the bone. Case closed due to lack of evidence. Presumed voluntary disappearance. They had erased her. Emily swallowed hard. She needed to show this to Thomas. But just as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. Another file, tucked beneath the missing persons report. A death certificate. Her breath hitched. The name on the document made her blood run cold. Eleanor Carter. Dated 1 year after her disappearance. Emily's stomach twisted violently. The town had known. They had declared her dead, without ever finding her body. And there, at the bottom of the page, was the name of the man who had signed off on it. William Carter, Thomas's father. That evening, Emily met Thomas behind the church, where the trees swallowed the last rays of daylight. "You found something," he said the moment he saw her. She handed him the documents, her hands shaking. Thomas scanned the missing persons report, his jaw tightening, but when his eyes landed on the death certificate, his face turned to stone. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then, in a voice so low it barely carried, he whispered, "He had her declared dead." Emily nodded. 1 year after she disappeared. Thomas's hands clenched into fists, the paper crumpling under his grip. "He knew," he growled. "He always knew." Emily reached for him, but he stepped back. His entire body was trembling with rage. "My whole life," he said bitterly. "I thought maybe she ran away. Maybe she couldn't take it anymore." But she didn't believe. His eyes darkened. She was taken, and my father made sure no one ever found her. Emily felt the depth of his pain, the betrayal that cut deeper than any wound. "What are you going to do?" she asked cautiously. Thomas lifted his gaze to hers, and for the first time, she saw something terrifying in his eyes. "I'm going to make him pay." The next day, the storm began. Thomas confronted his father. Emily wasn't there, but the whole town heard about it. The shouting echoed through the streets, reaching every ear, every doorstep. Thomas had gone straight to the Carter estate, one of the largest homes in town, where his father still lived in wealth and comfort. "You killed her," Thomas had roared, his voice shaking the very foundation of the house. His father had met his rage with cold indifference. "You don't know what you're talking about," he had replied. But Thomas wasn't a child anymore. He had evidence. He had truth. The fight escalated. The neighbors whispered of raised voices, the sound of glass shattering. No one dared intervene. Then, suddenly, Thomas was gone. His father, too. Vanished. For days, the town buzzed with speculation. Some said Thomas had fled in anger. Others believed something far worse had happened. Emily, however, knew one thing for certain. Something had been set in motion, something irreversible. and the truth was far from over. A week passed. Then, on a quiet morning, the sheriff received an anonymous tip. A location. Near the abandoned mine, just outside of town. When the authorities arrived, they found two things: a shallow grave and the body inside. The town held its breath. For 20 years, Eleanor Carter had been missing. Now, she had finally been found. But there was something else. Nearby, in the thick of the trees, they found another body. William Carter, dead. Emily sat on her porch, numb with disbelief. The town was in chaos. Eleanor Carter's murder had been hidden for decades, buried under silence and fear. Now, her killer had met the same fate. The whispers swirled like wildfire. Thomas had done it. He had uncovered the truth and delivered justice with his own hands. But Thomas was gone. Vanished, just like his mother once had. Emily clutched the last letter he had left for her, his words etched in ink, heavy with finality. Emily, I know you tried to save me, but some things can't be forgiven. I had to finish what was started. I had to make things right, but I can't stay. I won't let this town consume me the way it consumed her. Please, don't look for me. Thank you for seeing me when no one else did. Yours, Thomas. Tears blurred her vision as she read the letter over and over again. He was gone, and yet his presence lingered like the ghost of a love that could have been. The town moved on, as towns always did. But Emily never forgot. Because in the end, the greatest tragedy wasn't the truth. It was that love had been buried alongside it. Ghosts of the past. The town of Willow Creek had never been the same after that fateful discovery. Eleanor Carter's body had finally been unearthed, confirming what some had suspected for years. She had never left by choice. But her long-buried remains were not the only grim revelation. Her husband, William Carter, had been found dead in the same woods where she had been hidden for over 2 decades. The whispers grew louder with each passing day, speculation turning into certainty. Everyone believed Thomas had killed his father. But where was Thomas now? Emily had not left her house much since the discovery. She knew the town was watching her, waiting to see if she would confess to knowing something, anything, about where Thomas had gone. But the truth was, she had no idea. Since the day she had read his letter, she had been living in a daze, carrying the weight of his words like an unshakable shadow. Please, don't look for me. She had tried to honor that. But as the days stretched into weeks, and the town slowly returned to its routines, she found herself consumed by a single thought. Where was he? Had he truly disappeared forever? Or was he still watching from somewhere, waiting for the dust to settle? One evening, as the sky melted into shades of orange and violet, she made a decision. She would find him, no matter what it took. Emily started where she knew Thomas had been last, the Carter estate. The grand house sat on the edge of town, still looming with the same presence it had when William Carter was alive. But now it felt empty, lifeless. Most of the staff had left, unwilling to work in a house that had become the scene of a murder. The doors remained locked, the curtains drawn, as if the house itself was in mourning. But Emily knew there was something inside. A clue, a sign, something that could tell her where Thomas had gone. She had to find a way in. That night, she returned under the cover of darkness. She wore a simple dress and soft-soled shoes, her heart pounding as she crept toward the back entrance. The door was locked, as she had expected, but the small cellar window near the ground wasn't. Taking a deep breath, she pried it open and squeezed herself through, landing in the cool, damp basement with a soft thud. The house was eerily silent. She moved carefully, her hands grazing old furniture and forgotten relics as she made her way toward the stairs. When she reached the main floor, she paused, listening. Nothing. The house was completely still. Slowly, she moved toward William Carter's study. If Thomas had come back here, this was where he would have gone. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating the heavy wooden desk at the center of the room. Papers were still scattered across the surface, untouched since the day William Carter had died. Emily stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the documents. Old business records, land deeds, correspondence, and then a letter. Her breath hitched as she unfolded it. It was addressed to William Carter, dated 1 week before he was killed. "I know what you did." The words were scrawled in heavy ink, the handwriting unmistakable. It was Thomas. Emily's heart pounded. This was a warning. Thomas had confronted his father before he died. But had he killed him? Or had something else happened that night? She turned to search for more, but a sudden noise made her freeze. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Someone was in the house. Emily barely had time to react before she heard footsteps descending the stairs. She scrambled into the shadows, pressing herself against the wall just as a figure stepped into the study. A man, tall, broad-shouldered. For a terrifying second, she thought it was Thomas. But when the figure moved into the moonlight, her breath caught in her throat. It was Daniel Carter, Thomas's brother. Emily's pulse raced as she watched him move toward the desk, his hands grazing over the papers as if searching for something. Her mind whirled. Why was he here? Had he known about his mother's murder all this time? Had he been part of it? Emily barely breathed as Daniel muttered to himself, his fingers tightening around one of the documents. Then, without warning, he turned sharply, his gaze sweeping across the room. Emily ducked behind a chair, her heart hammering. She heard his footsteps approach. Closer, closer, and then he stopped. Silence stretched between them. Emily forced herself to remain still, even as her lungs burned for air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel turned away. His footsteps retreated, and moments later, she heard the front door open and close. Emily exhaled shakily, waiting until the house was completely silent before she dared to move. She had to get out. But as she turned to leave, her eyes landed on the last paper left on the desk. She hesitated before reaching for it. Her blood turned to ice as she read the words. "If you want to know the truth about what happened to your mother, meet me where it all began." There was no signature. But Emily didn't need one. She knew exactly who had written it, and she knew exactly where Thomas had gone. The abandoned mine. It had been closed for years, left to rot on the outskirts of town. But once, it had been the beating heart of Willow Creek, a place where men labored under the earth, where fortunes were made, and where secrets were buried. If Thomas had gone back there, he wasn't just looking for answers. He was looking for justice, and Emily was going to find him before it was too late. Ignoring the fear curling in her stomach, she turned on her heel and flowed into the night. The truth was waiting, and it would change everything.